Welcome to Agency Office Hours for May 2022. I'm Karl Sakas at Sakas & Company, helping you make smarter decisions to grow your agency more smoothly. Every month on the second Tuesday, we get together and I answer your questions live about growing your agency. Here's a preview of the questions that I will be answering today. And if you'd like to submit a question for a future event, just include it when you RSVP. My colleague Kate will share the link for that. If you're joining live or if you're watching the recording, it will be in the video description. So here's what is coming up. Zach in South Carolina has a question about client delegation. Specifically, if you are the agency owner and you are the primary client contact or one of them, how do you get that day-to-day account management off your plate? We'll talk through that. Then Jeremy in Michigan has a question about documentation. How do you find the right level of documentation? Not too much, not too little. Then I'll share about how to make time to plan for the future. It can be hard to do amidst day-to-day firefighting, day-to-day challenges, but it is possible. Then Cornell in Pennsylvania has a question about niching down, about specialization. Specifically, what if you want to specialize, but one of your clients in that industry doesn't want you to work with any of their competitors? What are your options? We'll talk through that. And finally, Mackenzie in Iowa has a question specifically about freelancer management. If you're working with freelancers and you've lined them up for an upcoming project or retainer, and they want to know when specifically will you need them, when maybe you're not quite sure, what should you do? Again, if I mentioned your name, be ready to come off mute when your turn is up. And if you're watching live, you'll get the recording within the next 24 hours. And if you're watching the recording, well, you've got the recording right now. Don't share anything out loud. You don't want to become public since we are recording and sharing the video. All right. Well, Zach, if you want to unmute yourself first and come on video, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So to paraphrase, your question is this, and then if you could elaborate a bit, you asked, how can agency owners transition day-to-day client management to another team member? Please tell us more.
Yeah, so we've grown to where we have, I guess, like a full team, but they're all in specialist roles. The ad guys and girls, and different things like that, operations manager. But it's to the point now where it's like we have enough folks, and my partner and I, we're still the ones on the biweekly client calls, stuff like that, and we want to try to replace ourselves and get someone else, kind of helping with managing projects and client communication. We haven't ever really passed that off to someone, so that's the one piece that we've kept to ourselves that we're ready to pass off. And just looking for any kind of tips or best practices. I guess to note too, we're fully remote, folks all over the planet. So, that's kind of how we'd be most likely as somebody from somewhere else.
Got it. That makes sense. And it sounds like then your clients are spread out as well.
Yeah, I mean, they're all in the US, but yeah, they're all over the country.
Got it. Okay. Well, a few things to consider. First, congrats on being at this point. In my work with over 400 agencies, very few agency owners want to continue being the account manager. So, you're in good company. It is worth considering there are 6 different agency roles, and you're starting to be at the point where you can divide those up so that people aren't doing 2 or 3 at once. You could do just 1. But as a summary, those 6 roles are account management, which is keep the clients happy and often sell them more work. Project management, which is get the work done smoothly and profitably. And project management can apply to retainers as well, not just projects. Your subject matter experts, those would be, depending on your services, design, development, writing, analytics, things like that. You've also got your client strategists, who are sort of like a super SME. They're doing client strategy, and they tend to be very client-facing. Their job is to maximize where the client's budget goes, right? They've got a certain budget. What's the best way to deploy it? Also, you'll have biz dev, which is marketing, sales, and partnerships. And finally, you'll have support, which is operations and leadership, keep things running in the right direction, both short-term and long-term. So from what you've described, it sounds like you're ready to potentially split off account management so that you aren't doing it. Now, would you and your partner likely still continue doing client strategy, or do you need someone who'd be the day-to-day contact and the strategist for the client? Where are you on that?
We'll probably still do strategy because we just have like the most experience in our niche. So
Yes.
we'd be driving the strategy, but have everyone else kind of execute, everything that we would put together.
Makes sense. So with that in mind, and that's a common transition, the hardest things for owners to get off their plate are typically sales, though not impossible, and client strategy. Also not impossible, but hard. So here's how you would likely structure that, and then we'll look at how to implement it. And by the way, for anyone who is listening live, if you could share in chat, what have you done to shift how you handle account management at your agency? Please share in chat. So Zach, in terms of the details, what you'd ultimately want to do is structure it so that someone is designated as the client's day-to-day contact. They might have an account manager title, they might have something else. The idea is that they bring you in as the client strategist occasionally. That'll certainly be at kickoff, right at the beginning, you need to be there. You might be there at, say, quarterly meetings where you're reviewing progress, maybe early on where you're delivering and basically presenting certain strategy-related deliverables, things like that. And then sometimes on an ad hoc basis. But importantly, you are not going to be in every single weekly or every other week or monthly meeting. You'll be there, maybe a quarter of the time, more at the beginning and more at major milestones, but not every day. We'll get into how in a moment, but what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, that would be perfect. So that's a good next step for sure.
Now, a key thing with this is the person who is the account manager needs to know, as I say, account managers need to know enough. They need to know enough about the work. They need to know enough about the client industry so that when a client asks them a question, where they're the first point of contact, the AM doesn't, mess things up. For instance, at one point as a director of client services, I was doing a range of different roles. And at one point, we needed a client's vector logo as part of a website redesign project. And I reached out to the client and asked for, a vector logo. And they sent me a file called something like vectorlogo.jpg. Yeah, now, if I didn't know enough, I just would have forwarded that to the creative team and said, here's the vector logo. But of course, I knew that if it was a JPEG, by definition, it couldn't be a vector logo. And so then I was able to follow up with the client, clarify, do you have a .eps or PDF or AI version? That's the one we'll need. So, obviously more things tend to be, more complicated than that. But the key is the account manager needs to know enough so that the client doesn't feel like they're talking to someone who knows nothing. Currently, what is the overall expertise level for the people who'd succeed you as account manager?
Yeah, so that's the thing, is that would be a new hire, I guess. Well, we kind of had it. We hired a project manager early on this year. Yep. It just didn't work out for various reasons. So we have to rehire for it. But we're just trying to make sure we do it right this time and everything go smooth. So
yes.
And you mentioned something too about potentially a project manager and account manager being separate. We were thinking of maybe that being the same, but maybe that's not the right approach. I don't know.
What is your current team's headcount right now?
So there's 8 of us. So really it's my business partner and I, operations, and then the rest are in specialist roles.
You are at the point now where you may, just out of necessity, need to combine account management and project management. For instance, I worked at an agency with 12 people. We had dedicated strategists, not the owner, dedicated strategists. And as the project manager, I was also the account manager. I was the first point of contact. Now, a key thing, and this is true for everyone who is considering hiring someone who is a client contact, but also doing internal project management, which way do you need them to lean? Do you need someone who's more relationship oriented, more of an account manager, but they can do project management? Or do you need someone who's more of a project manager who can do day-to-day client service? Maybe that's not their favorite thing. In my case, I lean more toward PM. And so if I had a really difficult client situation, I would talk to our salesperson who was more relationship oriented and say, here's what I'm thinking of doing. Is there anything you recommend I do differently? And often he had suggestions, right? Because that was just easier for him. And likewise, I would often help him with details. So it was a good, symbiotic relationship. So I think a key thing for you to decide, if you need a project manager, do you need someone who is a PM who can take care of clients, or an account manager who can take care of PM? What's your sense of that?
I'd probably rather have like the account manager. That's probably better with people. We have templates for most everything, so it's really just kind of making sure that things are running smoothly, and our operations person can help with that anyway. So definitely somebody that can talk to folks, and like you said, that is aware enough to what's going on and can speak intelligently about it.
Makes sense. And keep in mind, if you lean toward account management, you may want to build in some guardrails. People who lean toward AM tend to be people pleasers. That's part of what makes them good at account management. But that can also lead to them giving away free work because they want the client to like them, and nothing makes a client like you like saying, and that's free. No, no charge for that kind of thing. So you may want to put in some guardrails where, for instance, maybe you or your business partner will be the bad guy, where the account manager could say something like, oh, that sounds great. Let me confirm what that looks like budget-wise, and I'll get back to you. That way they could say, oh, I wish we could do it. We're going to need to add $5,000 to get that done. Would you like us to do that? Does that make sense?
That does. Yeah, super helpful.
The final thing to keep in mind as you sort through this is consider potentially starting this with newer clients so that you're ultimately transitioning your longest term clients toward the end of the process, right? With a new client, you can say, hey, onboarding's coming up, welcome. From a sales perspective, you're introducing them to their account manager. The new client doesn't know it's worked any other way,
That's true.
May take longer for existing ones. And I'm seeing some comments in chat. Thank you for everyone who's sharing. Jeremy, you mentioned preparing another senior team member who was formerly a subject matter expertise to assume AM responsibilities. For sure, SME to account manager can be a great transition because they know what they're talking about. The AM knowing enough, they know a lot. That also can be a good transition if you've got a subject matter expert or maybe an account manager who wants to become a salesperson. Those tend to become the best salespeople because they know the material. And usually they want to do this because they want to make more money, which they usually can as a salesperson. Tends to be a good transition. Katie, thank you for sharing. You mentioned you're considering adding a project manager, especially for website projects. That is a good point there. The more complex the work is, the more likely you probably want to lean toward having a project manager involved. It depends on the work. Katie, as you were saying, you've seen increased productivity and efficiency as you split the roles. My guess is, and I see this across the agencies I work with, you'll probably see an increase in morale as well. If you get to the point that you can split account management and project management, people get to do what they're really good at rather than what they're stuck having to do. Although my PM 101 course can help with that. If you've got someone who needs to do PM.
We're going through it right now.
Oh, yeah. Well, before we shift over to Jeremy, Zach, any other things that stand out around your specific next steps?
I don't think so. I think I have a little more clarity than before about how to approach it. So I appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, Zach, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having my question.
All right. Well, next up is Jeremy. Jeremy, if you want to come on camera and come on off mic. Jeremy, welcome to Agency Office Hours.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So the question that you had submitted when you signed up, specifically you were asking about documentation and ultimately, how do we find the right balance on documenting the right amount of detail in our processes? Yeah. Please tell us a bit more about your question and let's answer it.
Sure. Well, I mean, like so many agencies, process documentation has been a thorn in our side from day one, and
Yes.
we're 7, 8 years in, and it continues to be a challenge. We've made progress in some respects by sort of mapping out and documenting big picture, like the flow, the life cycle of a client relationship, and kind of the month in, month out, pieces and parts of the work that we do, but really mostly from a what, who, and when perspective, and less of a how perspective,
Ah,
right? And so that has sufficed for a long time because our team were all, reasonably senior. We didn't have a lot of junior team members, and so this was often, somebody's third agency that they'd
yeah.
worked at, and they were, they had strong enough fundamental skills in, their subject matters that we didn't need to tell them how to perform keyword research, or to tell them how to, like optimize, a set of search ad campaigns or something like that. It was more so our documentation was really more sort of the monthly cadence of our retainer relationships. Like, here's what's got to be done by when, by who, how much time you should spend on it, whatever. But not like, okay, so you open up this interface and you do
Yeah.
X, Y, Z, whatever. And now that we've added a few more junior members to the team, it becomes a little bit more relevant. It's becoming evident that maybe a little bit of like the climb marketing way of doing those more granular, the how, sort of tasks needs to get codified. But man, we've tried that in the past, and it just collapses under its own weight. And it's really difficult to carve out the time to do that to a degree of detail that at least some of us feel would be useful. We have resorted recently to doing like, voiceover screen capture video of like certain common tasks or activities, but that in and of that is also, a little laborious. And how many of those are we going to produce? So anyhow, so I lay that at your feet, and I'm curious what your thoughts are.
All right. Well, and by the way, for anyone who's listening live, if you could share in chat, what do you do to document things at your agency? Whether it is, as Jeremy mentioned, what's the documentation on the cadence of things, and or what's the documentation on specifically how to do certain things? So, Jeremy, to your question, ultimately, how do you find the right balance on documentation? Documenting not too little, but not too much. It sounds like you're at a key transition point, and this happens at various points for different agencies, as you go from a mostly senior team to bringing in more junior people. It's typically a good business decision because you have team members who labor-wise aren't quite as expensive, but ultimately are billing fairly highly. So it makes sense. But you run into the challenge where it's not just knowing what to do each month, each quarter, each week, what have you, but how to do it. You've been trying some things that make sense, right? If you're recording the screen share, whether you're using Loom or something like that, I know Loom has added some new features to organize the library of videos across your team, which could be helpful. Or worst case, you have an intranet or even just a running Google Doc or set of Google Docs with links to the relevant thing. It is worth considering that if people are new and they don't have a ton of experience, the how to, rather than what to do when, will be increasingly important. So I'm glad that you're dedicating time to it.
Yeah.
To your question about it being laborious, to some extent, there's no way around it being laborious to first document things.
Yeah.
So you're not alone in that. The good news is, once you get the documentation down, in theory, you don't have to do it again, unless say mentioned in some of the keyword research, say there's an algorithm update, you might need to make some updates, based on that. But in terms of the laboriousness. Something that some clients have found is helpful is to basically recruit a virtual assistant or someone on a more administrative basis to be basically the audience for the screen share. They may not be the person who's actually implementing the advice, but it can help for the person recording the training to have someone asking questions and have an audience, to think of a specific real person. Of course, if you have junior people, you could have your senior people doing live recordings with them, actually training them on things. I would also say there is value in having some of the how trainings, even for more senior hires, both current team members and future ones. Just because they've done it before doesn't mean they do it the way that you need. If we think about even just common terms, for instance, wireframe, for most agencies, wireframe is basically the UX design, the black and white version of generally what goes where, and then eventually that becomes a visual design or a UI if you're doing development kind of work. But at some agencies, a wireframe is a synonym for the sitemap for a website or for an app or things like that. So if you tell a new team member, I need a wireframe by the end of the week, you may be surprised by what they create. So that can be helpful. What's your reaction so far, Jeremy, on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's some promising avenues in there. I do like the idea of sort of leveraging the existing training, one-on-one training that's taking place with junior members of the team to capture that over video and sort of get some double duty out of that time. So it sounds like for a little bit more of the nitty-gritty nuanced stuff, the consensus is that video might actually be the most promising avenue to take. Is that the consensus?
Probably.
Yeah.
Now, there are services out there where, say, if you record the video, they create more of a written with screenshot version, right? They're capturing screenshots from the video and they're writing it up. It may make sense to get help on that. I think a key point, and this is true for you, Jeremy, as well as for everyone who's listening, you want to prioritize things, right? If you've got something that's happening every week or every month, that's probably an important thing to document, especially if it's time consuming. On the other hand, if you've got something that happens once a year, that may not be as critical unless it's a majorly important once a year kind of thing, in which case you probably want to do that. So basically think about, what is the frequency of it? And also what is the impact if it's done poorly? Related, I would also include, and this is true for everyone, why. Why is following this documentation important? People don't always know. You might list the points, but they may not realize why it matters. And when people have a greater sense of meaning in what they're doing, even if it's just, we're trying to create a stronger client experience. So for instance, we need you to reach out to the day-to-day contact before their all hands meeting so that you can sort out any challenges that, say, their boss might have some concerns. The goal is to sort that out one-on-one rather than risk embarrassing them in front of their boss. So the more you can explain why, it helps people get context on things.
Yeah.
I'm seeing a few suggestions in chat as well. Zach mentioned you'd come across, hadn't used it yet. Clickminded.com has an SOP library. Certainly here at Sakas and Company, we have the Agency Profitability Toolkit with 60 plus tools, templates, trainings, things like that. Elaine mentions using subtasks in Reich, the PM system, to document steps, how-tos, training newbies, or this is a great point, using it as a template for a recurring project, right? If you've got something that needs to happen every single time, build it as a template in your project management system so you can spin it up in one click or maybe a couple clicks so that people have all of the things they need to do in one place rather than having to reinvent it. That helps onboard people faster. Katie mentioned using a knowledge base to address processes, common questions, and links to examples. Delegation, a great point. If you've got a team member who just worked on a particular thing, they're probably a good person to document it.
Yeah.
Also, if you, and this is true for everyone, if you have a team member that you just onboarded, they are the perfect person to ask for help, because odds are if they were confused about something, it is still fresh, and you have a chance to address that. Meredith mentioned using Slab to house information, processes, so on. Basically as the intranet for the agency, noting that developing the content documentation is an effort in and of itself, but now you have a place to store it, makes sense. Elaine, ditto on Loom, and Kate, my colleague, has shared some additional resources. So, and I see we have note on Slab, expensive, but worth it. Well, Jeremy, what are your next steps from here?
Yeah, I'm gonna go through. So, we currently use Basecamp as our collaboration software, and that is where sort of that scaffolding of the what, when, and who live. But I think within each of the tasks that are identified there, we can start to, create training videos, maybe using Loom. I didn't realize that Loom, you could kind of use it as an organizational sort of platform. But maybe start doing more of those linked to from those little subtasks, as well as links to examples, and start there, and leaning into our new hires that are more junior to help shape what we need to document.
It also shows them that that you care about their having a good experience. Like I know you want them to have a good experience. It helps illustrate that you care when you're checking in about what's been confusing. Is there something confusing that's not clear? That might be a good thing to sort out. So you were right at the inflection point for your agency to make some changes, and I look forward to hearing how they go.
Excellent. Thanks a lot. Appreciate everybody's feedback.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeremy. So coming up, we have questions from Cornell about niching down, and from Mackenzie about freelancer management. But first, a word from our sponsor, me. Today's Agency Office Hours is sponsored by Agency PM 101, a new on-demand course from Sakas and Company, designed to help up-level people on your team who have been reluctantly deputized as part-time project managers. Here's the bonus tip for you. Specifically, my advice on helping you make time to plan for the future. Now, if you are one of my coaching or consulting clients, you get access to a monthly private VIP office hours, similar to what we're doing today, but in a much smaller group, and everyone who joins is able to get an answer to their question. And something that came up in the latest VIP session was an agency leader who said, amidst his day-to-day firefighting, it's hard to make time to actually plan for the future. And some other people on the call said, yeah, it's hard to think more than a month out, another more than a quarter out, another is good at planning a year out, but it's hard to go beyond that. And so the question was, what do you do? Well, I want to share some tips for you if you're in that same boat, where you're busy dealing with day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month problems, but you are struggling to make time to plan out further. So, by the way, if you're joining us live, please share in chat. What do you do to make time to plan for the future? If you could, please share in chat. But here are my top 3 tips for you about how to plan and how to make time to plan for the future. Number 1, create a meeting cadence. Now, I have monthly meetings with my team about certain topics, for instance, finances, about marketing, and about product and service development. The idea is that each time we review progress on how each is going, and we make plans for the future. So although it's meeting month to month, it's about making progress toward things longer term. That's helpful. I also have in my weekly one-on-one meetings with my team time to talk about their professional development, so that we're making time to plan for their future. And some of that includes knowing, for instance, what they might be doing next year, but then what are they working on right now, rather than it all being a surprise. Ultimately, having that cadence, or those cadences, means I make time for the future because I'm turning it into a meeting And I know that, I'm going to talk about it and my team is going to ask me about it. A little extra accountability there as well. Tip number 2 is to create a long-term vision. Where do you want to be in the future? As Stephen Covey said, begin with the end in mind, because then you can actually work backwards on how to get there. There are various tools like Vivid Vision and the EOS Vision Traction Organizer, VTO. I use a tool that I've developed that I call the Advanced Retrospective, where you pick a future date and write about it as if it's already happened. You could do that for a year out. You could do it for 5 years out. This is like varsity level. You don't have to start here. About 5 years ago, I wrote about where I wanted to be at age 90, looking back, kind of thing. I would start with maybe 5 years in the future. That's a good place to start. And the idea is that you're writing about where you'd like to be. What is happening? What is your ideal situation? And then you can reflect on it and get your team's help in making it happen. And my colleague Kate is sharing a link in chat with the Advanced Retrospective template that you have available free of charge to help you plan for your future. Now, of course, thinking about a long-term vision, you still have to make time for it. Here's the thing, you're planning about something that is very far in the future. To me, that merits carving out some extra time, whether knowing yourself, maybe it's early morning, maybe it's later in the evening, maybe it's some time on the weekend. You're turning it into this really important appointment with yourself. And that's harder to ignore than, doing your expense report, though you should still do your expense report, though ideally delegated to a team member. So that's number 2, create a long-term vision. And tip number 3 on making time to plan for the future is this: pre-schedule time. For instance, my monthly meetings are on the calendar for the entire year in advance. I have these office hours on the calendar a year in advance. And I think Kate, my colleague, may be booking it out through the end of next year as well. So you don't have to wonder, and the time's reserved. Additionally, your team can help. For instance, I mentioned as part of my long-term plan, I wanted to do a 4-week sabbatical in 2023 as I celebrate the 10-year anniversary of what's now Sakas & Company. And at my team retreat a couple weeks ago, my colleague Diane said, let's get that on the calendar now. You know what? Indeed. So over a year in advance, I have scheduled a 4-week sabbatical for May and June of 2023. I see that people are sharing in chat, looking at some things people have mentioned, doing, for instance, a quarterly full day for the leadership team to identify priorities and strategy, and then annually meeting for 2 days. Comment, that sounds suspiciously like EOS. Is that the platform? Yep. I see a couple people are using EOS. For sure, EOS, the Entrepreneur Operating System, can be a great way to organize your agency. Also because it's quite popular, it can be a good way, recruiting-wise. You can hire people who've done EOS before. It can be a bit of a challenge to get there, but there are also pieces you can implement. Things like those quarterly meetings, things like having the Vision Traction Organizer to organize your plan, and things like same-page meetings with your number 2. We saw a comment about using the OKR model as well, objectives and key results. Whatever you do, it helps to have structure and it helps to have your team checking in. And Kate, I guess, speaking of getting the team's help, a question for you. I know that you recently were part of the team retreat. What did you observe as we were planning for the future up to even early 2024?
Yeah, well, I think one of the biggest things is the planning in advance. It's a lot harder to try and find a meeting in this week or next week, rather than let's schedule it out months in advance. So then when we get to that week, when the calendar is full, it's much easier to plan in advance. And at our team retreat, we talked about what we want at the end of this year, what we want at the end of next year, and having that goal in mind really makes it easier to see what steps we have to take to get there.
That makes sense. So Kate, thank you for sharing that. And for everyone who's listening, your team wants to help you, but they need to know where you want to go. They need to know, I call it your values, goals, and resources, VGR. Values and how you choose to operate, goals and where you want to go, and resources in terms of the time, money, people, software, and so on to get there. They want your help, but they want to help you, but they need your help. They can't read your mind. Now, planning for the future is not always easy. As a client once told me, it's hard to think about what you want to make for dinner when you've got a knife stuck in your leg. I am not sure where she got that analogy, but it certainly makes sense. It's hard to plan for the future when you're dealing with day-to-day firefighting. And when it comes to firefighting, one of the biggest challenges can be around project management, especially if you were a part-time project manager on top of everything else you're doing, whether that's as an agency owner or in any other role at your agency. And the thing is, PM is vital. It has to happen, but it's tough when it's one of many things on your list. A potential solution, that would be to go take or encourage your team to take, or both, my Agency PM 101 course. It's an on-demand course in 2 to 4 hours. You can up-level your project management skills to get things done, make your agency run more smoothly and more profitably. If you're joining us live, my colleague Kate is sharing the link to that, to Agency PM 101. You can get a preview of the course, including the first lesson video, as well as the whole course outline. If you're looking to bring 5 or more people from your agency to PM 101, you can get a team discount. An agency owner who has team members in the US and Canada mentions PM 101 is actually now part of their standard onboarding process for new team members, and people are enjoying it. So if that is of interest, we've got the link in chat to Agency PM 101, so you can learn more. All right, next up, we have a question on niching down from Cornell, and then a final question from Mackenzie about freelancers. So Cornell, if you want to join us, thank you for being part of Sakes Company Agency Office Hours today.
Yes, thanks for taking the question.
So when you reached out, you had shared a question related to specialization. Sometimes people are asking me, should they specialize? You don't have to, but certainly my specialist agency clients tend to be more profitable and less stressed and more confident about their future. So, the choice is up to you. Now, in your case, you mentioned you want to specialize. The challenge is this: you have a client that is in that industry already, and they have said they do not want you working with any of their competitors. That creates a bit of a challenge. If you could elaborate a bit on your situation, and then we'll find a solution.
Yeah, for all intents and purposes, we are what I'd call like a general practitioner as opposed to specialist. But we do have certain niches where we, have a bunch of clients in those industries just because we're very good at what we do. In this particular case, we had a long-term client that we've done a lot of work with, and then new ownership came in. The company was bought out, new ownership came in, and like, hey, we don't like you working with a handful of other people in our industry. So, we were posed with that, and it was either drop them or we're leaving type of thing.
Yeah.
So we weren't sure how to handle that. That's where the question came. But we've been in the business for 20 some years. We have lots of clients. So it's almost guaranteed. And because we're a general practitioner, it's almost guaranteed whoever I go into, whoever I talk to, there's a good chance we have a handful of people that do the same thing as you. And sometimes that's appealing. Sometimes it might be a turnoff. Yesterday I was at a meeting and he asked if we do, something similar to what he was looking to do. And it's like, yes, I dropped the name, and it's like, well, that's my direct competitor. It's like, if I knew that was you work for them, I wouldn't have called you, but we were already in a relationship or the meeting pretty far, and he was okay with that.
Yeah.
This morning I had a call and I felt like we work with a competitor of who I was the prospect, and I felt I didn't offer any information.
Yeah.
I don't like to hide anything, but if he would have asked, I would have told him. But I just feel like he might have had the same feeling. So my general question is, just as we come in, it just seems it happens more and more. There's just what they might call a conflict of interest, what I might view as, hey, we're very good at what we do, and that's why people come to us. And from the way I look at it, it's like, I'd love to have 10 of our clients be on the first 10 spots on Google's homepage. And if you want to be on the top spot, you have to come to us. But so I don't know how you address those, quote, conflict of interest or people in the same industries. And I hear advisors like you and others saying, well, you should niche down and specialize. I'm like, well, how do those people do it? Because there's all kinds of, I mean, that's what they're in. So any of those points you could speak to would be great.
Absolutely. And by the way, for everyone who's listening live, how do you approach specialization if you specialize, and concerns about conflicts of interest? If you could share that in chat. So ultimately, Cornell, to your question, you want to specialize, focus on a particular niche, but at least one of your clients in that niche doesn't want you talking with anyone else they see as a competitor. So the initial question ultimately is, are you willing to lose them as a client? You know, from a revenue perspective or otherwise, and you don't have to answer that out loud, but that is an important thing to consider, right? Are you willing to say, well, this is our specialization or one of our new industry focus areas. If you're uncomfortable with us working with others, then we can trigger the 30 or 60-day out clause or something like that. Now, your willingness to do that depends on how big they are, depends on a number of other factors. But I do think it's worth considering that as a business owner, you don't want any one of your clients holding you hostage. And if a client is like, we don't want you even talking to our competitors, that is an unreasonable request. Now, if it's a situation where that client and other clients are, for instance, competing directly on, say, non-geographic keywords, that could be a challenge, right? Because you're working to, one client to try to beat the other. On the other hand, if you're focusing on, local businesses, dentists, for instance, or many law firms, if someone is hiring a dentist, they are looking for a dentist that is near them, not a dentist on the other side of the country, kind of thing. So that could be a factor. And specific to and you don't have to share the specific industry, Cornell, but are your clients competing nationally or locally?
Yeah, it could be both in different cases. The one in particular that prompted the question is more of a national audience, but a lot of the ones we run to are more local.
One thing you could consider is whether to offer exclusivity in certain contexts. For instance, the only dentist in Atlanta. Although even then, there are, of course, sub-neighborhoods. Maybe it's the only dentist in Buckhead or something like that. So you basically carve out different geographic territories. Nationally, that's a bit harder. And in that case, you might need to decide how you approach that. Maybe you only work with more regionally oriented firms rather than the national sort of gorilla-sized clients. That's something you'll need to sort through. What some agencies will do is they'll have separate teams where one team is dedicated to one client, the other is dedicated to the other, and notably, they don't talk with each other about what they're doing. It's almost like a non-disclosure agreement within the agency. That's something that large holding company agencies will do, where they'll have different teams or even different agency brands. They're like sub companies where different ones are working with, different examples, like say, one with one national insurance company and one team with another insurance company, something like that. But it is worth considering also, are the people that are seeing themselves as competitors actually competitors? I've worked with, at this point, over 400 agencies one-on-one, and more than that with my different boot camp and other programs. Most often, agencies aren't direct competitors. There are some exceptions, but for instance, I have several clients who focus on marketing for law firms, and they're usually focused on different niches, whether it's based on the price point, whether it's based on the services. Most of the time, people aren't direct competitors. And I think one of the things that speaks to is if you have a client or a prospective client who is just naturally very paranoid, they're going to see everyone as a competitor and they want you all to themselves. Now, if the client is paying you $1 million a month and they want to be the only client, okay, I mean, that raises some other concerns, but it also comes down to what are they paying you? If you've got a legacy client that's paying you $1,000 a month, and that there are other clients who would gladly pay you $10,000 a month or more, sounds like they need an ultimatum back. Oh, you want exclusivity in this? Our new minimum for that is $10,000 a month. Would you like some options within that? So it also helps, by the way, to look for an analogy within their own industry. Do they work with suppliers, for instance, that serve others in their industry? Odds are yes. How does that impact them? Like, ideally, finding analogies from their own industry that can sometimes help make the case, okay, it's not as bad as they think. What's your reaction so far?
That's good. I think too, like the vendors, I mean, that could be like a product or something as opposed to a consultant or a marketing agency that's trying to propel. So it could be a little different argument. Yeah, I did think of the exclusivity in this case here. I don't even think they were coming with the automate. Well, they were, but I don't think it was like they were looking for a higher price to get that exclusivity. I think that it just came down to, hey, we have plans for a bigger budget, but there was nothing set in stone. And it wasn't like they were paying, an X factor on top of what everyone else was. To get to your first question, yeah, I would have been okay with them leaving away. And in fact, they did leave.
Since you had submitted wow.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess in a sense that they sort of solved that problem for you. But I saw a quote a few months ago, supposedly attributed to Abraham Lincoln, which this did not sound like something he actually said, but the quote was, I guess, supposedly for him, as a lawyer before becoming US president, 2 clients are a conflict, 3 clients are a specialization.
Yeah.
And I think a key thing is to be clear with your clients about what your approach is to confidentiality. I have a section on my website about confidentiality, and Kate, if you don't mind sharing that at /confidentiality, where basically I lay out, if you are a client, we have a non-disclosure agreement that's part of the client agreement, but my policy is I don't share things otherwise. Like I am promising that I won't share because it's a small industry. Yes, there are tens of thousands of agencies out there, but if you think about it, if I'm on a sales call and I'm talking about some private details about one of their competitors, they would be thinking, well, wait, is he going to do this about us too? And it's to the point even where unless someone has publicly referenced being a client or they've done a case study, I can't actually confirm if someone is or has been a client. And even when someone is a referral from one client to introduce a new client, I don't tell anything about either to the other. I mean, they're welcome to talk amongst themselves, but keep in mind that to some extent, having a policy and a practice of keeping confidentiality may be enough for most people. It is reasonable that they don't want to compete directly on the same keywords, the exact match keywords. But beyond that, you may have to decide, are they worth it or not? And sometimes the answer is yes. Often the answer is no. And Jeremy, thanks for sharing in chat. Mentioned we specialize in the services we provide, more in the services than in the customers, but occasionally you have cases where clients are direct competitors. And in that case, you're transparent and note that you're committed to staffing the different clients with different teams. So Cornell, before we shift to the final question today, what are your thoughts on next steps?
Yeah, I think you bring up some good points. I like the confidentiality promise. Maybe that's just something up front that builds that comfort level for new prospects. And I think too, in this, what posed that original question, I just think it was one of those cases where it doesn't always make sense. And unfortunately, it seemed like it was probably the right thing to do. But yeah, going forward, I think we just need to be mindful and kind of be transparent and talk through, and just if they don't like the situation, I don't know, maybe offer exclusivity if they're willing to pay for that, but hopefully it doesn't come to that.
It's an option, and I think a key thing is to weigh what is the opportunity cost for you. If you give them exclusivity, what are you giving up? You know, if they're paying you enough to make it worth it, it certainly can be. But I think the key thing, Cornell, from your situation, and hopefully for everyone else who's listening, being intentional about it rather than reactive should give you the best result possible, whatever that result might be.
All right.
Well, thank you for joining us today. Awesome. So we have one final question for today. The final question we have is from Mackenzie in Iowa. And it sounded like she had a conflict today, so she wasn't able to join the live session, but I'm going to answer her question anyway. Specifically, Mackenzie's question was this: we work with freelancers and they want to know when we will have work for them. What should I tell them when they ask, when specifically will we need them? Well, some of it depends on whether it's a project or retainer you've already sold, or if it is something that is hypothetical. It's a future potential engagement for a prospective client or a client that hasn't otherwise signed that they're going to move forward. If it's a prospect, be clear with your freelancers, right? Let them know it's hypothetical. Here's our general sense of how it will unfold. You know, we would likely need you at kickoff and at these stages, and we think that it'll take 3 months, 4 months, 12 months, a week, though that would be a very short engagement, you know, and give them an idea of what to expect. And also be clear that this is not a for sure deal. I'm sure we've all had clients over the years. I know I did as a PM, a director of client services, a director of operations, where, you know, they were in a huge hurry to get started, so they said, but when it came time to actually sign the contract or pay the initial payment, suddenly things weren't so urgent. Funny how that works out. So, you know, just because they say they're ready to get started doesn't mean they're actually going to. But if it's hypothetical, like, be as clear as you can, but it's okay that you're not going to be exact with your freelancers because you don't know. You know, be upfront about that. Now, what about it's a case where you've got a freelancer that you've booked to work on a particular project or an ongoing retainer, and they want to know at the beginning, when will you need them specifically? Well, first, consider that is a reasonable question, right? When you're working with your clients and they want you to be in a particular meeting or to be working on something at a particular point, or your team to be working on something, it's reasonable for you to want to know, when do they need you? And so, you know, there are a few things you can do with that. One may be, when it comes to scheduling, it may be perhaps your freelancer sets up a Calendly or similar so that you know when they're available. You know, and that doesn't mean they're going to be available to you at, you know, any hour and you know, on instant notice, but that could be helpful. So, you know, I mentioned pre-scheduling out my monthly meetings. I have a key team member as a freelancer working with us part-time who's involved in some of those meetings. And so ultimately, Kate can see, okay, when is the individual available, and schedule based on that, right? That makes that a bit easier. And it's also more partnership oriented. Even though it might be just a few hours each week, it's a bit more partnership oriented than saying, you know, kind of directively, we need you here at this time, rather than asking. But having the Calendly also saves on back and forth rather than trying to figure things out that way. Now, ideally, you have some sort of a project plan or some sort of a sprint related plan. You've got your backlog in general, and you can make some predictions about when you'll need that particular freelancer's skill set. Obviously, things can change, but, you know, say they're working more design oriented, you might need their help early on and then some bits along the way. If they're more development oriented, maybe you need their help at the beginning as part of kickoff and initial strategy, but you may not need all of their help as soon. You want to make some educated guesses, and you should be doing this with your full-time team anyway, right? From a resource management perspective. so that you're trying to avoid double booking people or underbooking people. And if this all sounds terrible, it may be a sign that you need someone in operations or resource management, or perhaps your senior most project manager to be thinking about this to get things done, because it has to happen whether you want it or not. You also might consider assigning some of your freelancers to specific retainer clients, because reasonably many freelancers want a certain amount of billables each week or each month. And so if they know that, you know, you've got 10 hours a month on XYZ client, they can predict their schedule, right? And also importantly, you have them lined up when you need their help. Maybe it's a client that has a weekly cadence, that kind of thing. That also comes in handy when you're doing projects. You know, if as you're trying to book freelancers, ideally you have several freelancers in each work type. You know, 3 to 5 designers, 3 to 5 developers, 3 to 5 copywriters. You know, it depends on the services you're offering. Ideally, a few people, so that when you need their help, they're more likely to, at least one person's available, but also not so many that you never call them. Because ultimately, if you've got a freelancer that you have on a you know, a retainer of some sort, and you need their help with something else, they're probably going to be more inclined to help you if you're paying them something every single month, and they're plugged into your agency and systems and so on, rather than like they hear from you every 2 years and suddenly you want their help right now. Something to consider. You know, ultimately, as you're working to improve how you work with your freelancers, do your best to manage their expectations, certainly in the sales process when you're selling an engagement. And then as you go, in general, the work that your project manager and perhaps resource manager, if you have one, are doing to schedule people out, that applies to your freelancers as well. Do your best to manage their expectations and consider the Calendly option to facilitate booking to know when they're available rather than guessing along the way. And as I mentioned, we shared an article about this. You know, if you may need people's help, get their advice, pay them a small budget each month to get advice from your freelancers to help improve your agency. Well, that wraps up Agency Office Hours for May 2022. I'm Karl Sakas with Sakas & Company. If you're watching us live, you'll get the recording within 24 hours. If you're watching the recording, like magic, you've already got it. We're meeting every second Tuesday. If you'd like to join us for our next event, you can register now for any date throughout the year. Our next event is coming up on Tuesday, June 14th. Thank you so much for joining us today, and good luck out there.